Very pleased to be here to talk about the lessons from attitudinal ambivalence. Yesterday, Rich talked about some measurement issues, and for some reason, some measurement issues will resurface now during the empirical part. If you go on Google and look for images on ambivalence, this is the feature image, and it raises some interesting questions about what we mean, whether we're talking about a variety of faces, some positive, some negative, or a combination of faces. Translation from Macintosh did not work here. So I'll do imagination exercise. There are three faces on this, on this slide. Want to guess the hidden face? It's Walt Disney. A really nice picture of Bill Clinton, looking very mixed, and this is Lee Kronbach, so we'll come back to that. But rather than those images, let's look at this image. So this is really the theme of my talk, and it's not what might be the obvious, which is that the reversible figures are a metaphor for the way we might experience emotions either simultaneously or one after another. So I hope you're working at seeing both the young woman and the witch in this case. But the theme of my talk really is whereas Rich approached the measurement of mixed emotions and ambivalence in a very positive way. I'm going to approach it in a way that's rather akin to the witches in Macbeth, in which I'm afraid I'm a portent of fear. There's a lot to be feared in measuring mixed emotions and particularly ambivalence. Okay, so the overview is, how is ambivalence like mixed feelings? What are the problems with measuring ambivalence? Then how do we apply this? And then some worry at the end. Okay, so reasons why people who even focus on true emotions and feelings and life satisfaction and well-being should care about the lessons from attitudinal ambivalence is that attitudes themselves overlap and shade into the things that people care about. They're attitudes to objects, attitudes towards politicians, but attitudes towards ourselves and our lives and our romantic partners are very similar to the issues that people care about in understanding the causes of a happy and satisfying life. And then finally, there's going to be this key issue in both cases about what does it mean to actually measure mixedness? What does it mean to measure co-activation? So I've looked at the issues of mixedness in many different ways. I'm going to be focusing on the work that comes out of the attitudinal ambivalence literature, but the other work includes such things as with Amos Tversky. When I was in graduate school, we looked at how people in developing or constructing their life satisfaction judgments combine the present and the past. And that is often a mixture of the good and the bad, and how is that mixture taking place? With Kim Bartholomew, when she was developing her theory of adult attachment, key issues are the way in which people resolve conflicting positive and negative feelings. In this case, their feelings about themselves and their feelings about their partner. In a long-running series of research with Sandra Murray, where we've looked at the effect of having idealization about the partner. It seems like it might be entirely about positive emotions. In fact, the heart of the research is how people integrate positive and negative through the processes of idealization. And then, as Jeff kindly mentioned, we've done some work on memory for mixed emotions. And in my consulting work, actually it comes up as well. This is some work I did on the California law that requires warnings for health risks. And there was a really interesting problem of how do you simultaneously communicate, in this case, to mothers of young children that eating tuna is a good source of protein, but eating the wrong kind or too much of it is bad. How do you communicate the lessons are not merely academic. Okay, so the story of attitudinal ambivalence on my part comes with conversation with a wonderful man, Mark Zana, who invited me into the project and and we worked together. And the issue here really came out of the fact that there were well-developed models of attitudes, but they were reoccurring crises about what do attitudes really do, how do they function, how stable are they. And as a result, in this period of time, which was the 90s, there was a lot of interest in when attitudes predicted behavior, when they didn't, and in particular, what were the structure of attitudes. So people started talking about things such as attitude strength or attitude accessibility, and one of these structural components was attitudinal ambivalence, which is, does it matter if two people both hold a positive attitude towards marijuana use, but one of them, and only one of them, also holds a negative attitude? So does that affect the way that the attitude works in practice? So that was the structural issue that we were interested in. And the work and the theorizing that came out both in Zana's work and in Cassiopo's work is certainly rooted in the history of conflict, whether it's Lewin's theory or back to Hull's theory of the reinforcement learning, the basic nature of having the approach avoidance conflict. So that was there. And so one of the primary outcomes of this research from a variety of different labs was creating indices of ambivalent emotions. Rich talked about this in some detail yesterday, and the question were, which Jeff has answered very well, but in the attitudinal domain, is it reasonable to say that I have both positive attitudes towards marijuana and negative attitudes towards marijuana? That's the simple coexistence and co-activation question. And one of the ways that we and others puzzled about this was, is there a difference between thinking about mixed emotions as essentially a storage problem? I have information, I have feelings that are stored in my memory that are both positive about marijuana and negative about marijuana. And is that the same or different from the experience I have where I am conflicted and torn between thinking good things and bad things about marijuana? So that is something, that's the easy question. Does coactivation occur? Can you measure it? And there's a lot of good research on that one. And then what we and what others wanted to do was to go ahead and then say, once we have measures or indices of ambivalence, what does this predict? And one way, in fact, Jeff mentioned this in talking to a question yesterday, you can think about this as, is ambivalence or mixed feelings or being bittersweet even, is it an emergent property that's different than merely holding the sum of the positive and negative components? And as it's been practiced, the question becomes, is it a quality, an emergent quality that then moderates the relation between some stored attitude and the way that you behave? And this became both research from Mark's lab and research on all kinds of labs, very, very active question. And the way that Mark approached it, and we addressed it in the indices, was to ask a question simply breaking down into the completely positive questions. How do you feel about euthanasia? But think only about the positive things, and then do the same thing about the negative things. And one of the key points, again, Jeff has kindly attributed to this work, was the fact that we made this fairly strong distinction between potential ambivalence, which is stored, ready to come out, and experienced or direct ambivalence. Right. And then, as you saw in Rich, based on a theoretical analysis, we argued that there should be two key components, which was, as both positivity and negativity increase, we should feel more conflict, and as the difference between positivity increases, we should feel less conflict. So that the two sources of intensity and similarity would give rise to ambivalence. Now, even at this time, we were intuitively aware, or we talked about the fact that in practice, although we can define this set of characteristics that should characterize what ambivalence would look like, it was a different thing to actually create a measured index. And we've got some examples here. Let's look at the example of the newlywed couples, something that we work with Sandra Murray still. We find, happily, that most newlywed couples have a high degree of positive attitude towards their partners. And that's across the board. On the other hand, there are also some newlyweds who have negative attitudes towards their partners. So the variation in the data is completely on the negative affect or negative attitude dimension. Nonetheless, if we mindlessly go ahead and measure an ambivalence index that is theoretically based as we have here, we're going to come up with numbers and we're going to assign those people who have high positive and high negative scores an high ambivalence number, assign those people who have high positive and low negative scores a low ambivalence number. And we're now assigning two things to the people on the basis of a variation only in negative affect. We're assigning them scores on ambivalence. So this distinction between sort of clear theoretical index and problems in measurement was an issue from the beginning. Turn it around and say, if you're talking about people who know they're dying, most of them will have some negative attitudes towards their life or their circumstances, but they may vary mostly on how positive they are, right? Makes sense? And so when you look at people who are ambivalent, you will be looking at people who vary mostly on the positive dimension. And on one hand, who cares? They're high on positive and negative. The variation is on positive. Is that really going to worry us? It's kind of goes back to what Phoebe said about the difference between really understanding the theory of the brain and the processing versus the experience itself. But what I want to leave you with, and now we're going to sort of redo what Rich did yesterday, little with data involved. But what I want to leave you with is this is not an isolated problem to attitudinal ambivalence. I mean, this, well, I'm going to give away what I'm going to show, but what people do is they say, oh, this is a problem, let me measure ambivalence directly. Let me measure how bittersweet you feel. Let me measure how torn you feel. Let me measure how conflicted you feel. But that in no way solves the problem. If the basic process that their experience comes from a mixture of positive and negative sources, and the variation is only on one of those sources, your measurement of mixedness, even though it doesn't ever address positive and negative separately, will still carry the same issues of, is this a negativity effect or is it an ambivalence effect? And it's a very difficult problem. Okay, very difficult. Okay, so what we did, and Rich showed you this before, so the idea where a model comes from was just to say that, it's like the reversing cube, isn't it? If you look at it the right way, can I wander over here? Anyone tell me I'm allowed to? If you look at this the right way, you should be able to see, which you can't get on the screen, that as you go up the diagonal, there's increasing ambivalence. Come up this way, as you go down these diagonals, off diagonals, ambivalence is decreasing. Right? So this is that theoretical index. If you have all the data and all the areas of the quadrants, you can test and whether that's going to fit. But what we did was some very simple things at first. We said, what if we eliminated measurement error? What's going to be the correlation between the pure positive and pure negative? Again, Jeff talked about that. You're never going to expect to get a perfect negative correlation, but even reducing negative error, there's lots of evidence that they're somewhat independent. But we went another step and looked at things such as, is there a general tendency towards ambivalence? And so doing the measurement as we did, doing it on euthanasia, doing it towards mandatory AIDS testing, find very small correlation there. And the correlations to a direct measure of experienced ambivalence, in this case the Jameson measure, 0.47, was moderately high. But we're doing this without addressing that concern I had that we talked about, the fact that there's the potential for confounding between perhaps variation only on one of the dimensions. Okay, I can see that a little more clearly. So what to do about it? Well, Rich showed this one. Well, rather than simply worrying about it, which is what I was doing, Jeff Edwards, who is here at Michigan, provided a set of constraint tests that could be used across a wide variety of models. And here's one where if your constraint is simply that you should have some absolute difference. And he said, this is what the absolute difference model, and then he said, here's the constraints that are necessary to test that. And Rich went into this that said, following Edwards, Ulrich et al. In 2008 said, we shouldn't just be measuring ambivalence, we should be doing these tests. And I wanted to break it down a little bit beyond what Rich did, and even though the equation looks bad at the bottom, it's really very straightforward. The key issue is that when you have an absolute value, you can always take that absolute value out and describe it in two steps. If positive, negative, then greater than negative, this is step one. If negative greater than positive, then it looks like step two. And these funny numbers of 1.5n and minus 0.5p simply reflect the rather arbitrary choice that we used to say, okay, the intensity of ambivalence is measured simply by the average of positive and negative, so that because we have a 2 dividing it, it's translated through the algebra into the difference of weights. So at the bottom of the page, in not very nice Macintosh translated script, you have the actual equation that you're looking to recover from a multiple regression equation. So if you put in simply 3 variables, which are the weight, which switches the W, which switches depending on if positive is higher or negative is higher. You put in the negativity score, you put in the positivity score. Then if you have a good measure of direct ambivalence, you should get out this ratio of weights. Rich talked about that before, but the numbers look strange, and again, the reason the numbers look strange is just because we created that average which divided them by 2. And so you want to separate between things that are relatively arbitrary, like the 1.5 weight, which is a metric which could change easily, and the things that are fundamental, which is where there's positive coefficients and where there's negative coefficients, which really, as Rich said, define the model before. So we have that. And so, for example, when I look at something like this and I create an example based on our ambivalence index and use a regression equation to recover it, you'll notice that the coefficients do come back. So it is real. You do get a coefficient on the right surface of plus 1.5, minus 1.5, minus 1.5, plus 1.5. It's not a figment of imagination. It really does map onto that surface. So there's a test that says, is that the right surface? But starting my negative story is that the kind of measures that we have as direct measures of ambivalence are not necessarily pure measures of ambivalence themselves. Sometimes they're heavily weighted towards negativity themselves. And if they are, as we get in this case, we're going to find that we have purely positive outcomes, and just because it's all negativity driving the effect. But the problem is we still don't know if it's the problem with the measure of ambivalence or the measure of the index that we put into it. So there's one of the trouble we have. But what have people done? Try to wrap this up. What people have done, well, first of all, before these cautions came out from Ulrich and others, people would use these ambivalence measures and simply put them in moderated regressions and report them and say, look, ambivalence is changing the relations between attitudes and behavior. And if we throw this into something that Sandra, John Holmes, and I did, which is the longitudinal design, and it looks like there's a longitudinal effect of time so that newlyweds become less happy, and that's particularly true if they're more ambivalent. Okay, and that's just a straightforward moderation. But unfortunately, the same analysis from Ulrich says the test of moderation is also a test of a set of coefficients. Okay, so what do you think has happened now that we know that in order to define these coefficients across the index, in order to know that it's working properly, do you think that people have started to run and do the constraint tests? or have they avoided the whole area? They have avoided the whole area. So what people do is they will say, to avoid collapsing separate measures, we're going to measure directly, is what they're going to do here. They've said, instead of using the two measures, we're only going to take people with high levels of positive affect and then look at the effect of negative affect. Someone else said, to avoid having to look at the two dimensions, we're going to look at a multi-item scale and look at the variance of that scale as a measure of ambivalence. So what's happened is that the publication of these constraint tests that said this is a complicated story have driven people away from considering the separate dimensions at all, and instead of doing things that avoids the problem. But my conclusion, my last minute to you, is that does not avoid the problem. Inasmuch as these indices and the relation between the components and the indices are actually being computed in our head, they still exist. And if you're measuring tornness or bittersweetness or anything else, the same underlying confounds with especially negativity can be applied. Okay, so we're hooped basically, we're given a difficult choice. Either go through the constraints and really start to figure out what works and understand the data itself, or at the very least, all of us become conscientious about plotting in 3 dimensions and understanding the relations between what we're measuring and what the bases are, or even better, we'll turn it over to Rich, build as a field the sort of chains of construct validity from the fundamental components to the subjective experience, and hence on to the actual variables of interest, whether they're life satisfaction or relationships, or health or whatever else. So that's what I mean by saying that I want to act like the witches in Macbeth and say, toil, toil. There's a lot of work ahead, and we can't keep on doing the same things. Now, to the extent that, as many people in this room do, you're really only interested in measuring separately positive emotions and negative emotions, you're fine. You're fine. It's only if you ever want to do anything with the joint measurement of positive and emotions that you're in trouble. Thank you very much.